because that's the most, after we're saved, that's our first step in obedience, and to show it's a public picture of what Jesus has done, and it's a great opportunity for family and friends and others to come. And you know what a truth that is. Without Jesus, without God in this world, people are hopeless. They're just, they don't understand what it's about, and they don't think there's anything worth living for. But when you meet the Creator of the world, when you meet the Lord Jesus Christ, you find that there's everything worth living for. He's worth living for. You know, because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. You know, we can do those things because He lives. So thank y'all for those testimonies. That was really good. We'll try our best to switch gears. Turn in your Bible with me to Acts chapter 21, if you will. We'll just go as far as we can. No pressure tonight. Acts chapter 21. I was thinking we were going to get through 21 and into 22, but we'll see. We will see. We're quite a ways into chapter 21. I didn't realize chapter 21 was going to become a three-parter, I guess, or something. I'm losing track, actually, but it's taken a little while to get through there. Acts chapter 21. Like I said, I'm going to try to find the right place so we don't backtrack too far. If you recall, one of the things that we talked about at the end of last week was this concept of Paul sometimes would do things that kind of seemed a little contradictory, because he was an apostle, he was a missionary to the Gentiles, but then yet you would find him, approving of Timothy's circumcision, and then you find him taking a vow of sorts. And here, as he makes his way to Jerusalem, about the time, he just barely had arrived, and you've got the pastor there, James, in Jerusalem, and they convinced Paul to go with these four men and to basically kind of a vow thing that happened there. And we talked about, some of the reasons that might have happened. I used the verse in 1 Corinthians where Paul said, for though I be free from all men, yet I have made myself servant to all, that I might gain the more. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. And he goes on to say, to them that are without law, the Gentiles, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof for you. And I thought that was a reasonable thing to think about, as maybe the reason Paul would do these things. He wasn't obliged to do, wasn't obligated to do. In fact, in some cases could have been harmful if there would have been Gentile believers around, could have caused some contention, as it did in the book of Galatians. We see that letter that Paul wrote there. He actually kind of corrects Peter for some of the same behavior. But what I will say is, after the service was over last Sunday, two different people came up to me and told me the exact same thing, and I thought, well, there must be something to that. And I appreciate that. I remember those things, and I think about those things. And I believe it was Miss Yvonne and Brother Harvey, or I don't recall, or maybe it was, whoever it was, made this comment about, and maybe it wasn't Miss Yvonne, I don't put her on the spot, but basically this idea that old habit, I don't know if this is the right way to phrase it, but old habits are hard to break. In other words, it's hard to change. I think that's the way Brother Harvey put it. It is really hard to change. You've done something your entire life. You kept all these feasts and all these holy days, and you've done all this stuff your entire life, like Paul had done, and it's hard to change. And I thought, maybe I've complicated all this. Maybe that is it. It's hard to change. You've done these things your entire life. Now, we did talk about the one part that wasn't good about that. What he did was the fact that there was sacrifices involved. If you look there in chapter 21, Let's see if I can find the spot there. Verse 26, that's the part that I take a little bit of issue with. And for sure with that part, he says, "Then Paul took the men, these men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them." And we talked about, there's already been the one and only sacrifice for sin with the Lord Jesus Christ, who shed his blood for an atonement for our sin. And there's, God's not pleased with the blood of bulls and goats, and that doesn't appease his wrath at all, but rather what appeased his wrath was the shed blood of his only begotten Son. And that's important. I don't want to overlook that. And that's round about where we left off roughly. I think we got into verse 27 last week. So let's do this. Let's read verse 27 through the end of the chapter, Acts chapter 21, and then we'll just take a look at this, and Lord willing, we'll have time to finish this out, and then we'll be ready for 22 next week, Lord willing. All right, so let's start in verse 27. "And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, 'Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place.' For they had seen before with him in the city of Trophimus an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together. And they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And they went about to kill him. Tidings came unto the chief, and as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing and some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, I always have trouble with that word, tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him!" And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar, and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" But Paul said, "I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people." And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, and I think it's so funny, there's a chapter break right there. There's a comma. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I'm sure they were like, well, that's a long enough chapter, and, we don't want to make any of them too terribly long. I don't know. But that's why I said we may bleed into chapter 22 tonight. Lord willing, we might have time. We'll see. But in verse 27, I think we did cover this last week. It's interesting. Paul went through kind of the ritual process of this purifying time and all that. But I mentioned last week that didn't appease the Jews. It didn't. I don't know if say pull the wool over their eyes, but it didn't do anything to calm their hatred for Paul and what he stood for, what he had done. These Jews from Asia, they stirred up the people against Paul. They laid their hands on him. They brought accusations against him, and they stirred up the people. And it says there, a multitude of people. Can you imagine? I mean, Jerusalem was a big, thriving city. I mean, there's a lot of people there. And I mean, it wasn't that just stirred up a little stink over here, and a handful of people. No, this had riled up a multitude of people from Jerusalem. And, Paul is in a bad situation, no doubt about it. If you look there in the accusations in verse 28, they cried out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place. And further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city of Trophimus an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. I mean, it's quite a scene. You know, as it happened to Paul in various and other places, diverse places, using a Bible word, Paul finds himself under heavy persecution by a mob of people, a mob of Jews. The accusation brought against his teaching was really, they were saying, let me say it this way, the accusation brought against him was he was teaching against the law and that it was bringing harm to the people. And that he had polluted the temple by bringing in a Greek or a Gentile. And this was enough to get the whole city in an uproar. And then they captured Paul and they drug him out of the temple. You know, you think about things that are happening today in other countries, you know, and then you think even of what's happened in our country in recent, you know, in the last couple years, you know, this kind of mob mentality, you know, just kind of almost anarchy where people just, you know, take up arms themselves. They go and do destructive things. You know, I think that we felt like that was far removed from us, but now we're seeing it's right at our own back door, and it's kind of it's a very sad thing when you think about it. And you know, I would say that as believers, you know, you're going to have to toughen up a little bit because, you know, Lord willing, and my prayer is we don't ever see persecution like they see in North Korea or in China or other places, and are beginning to see in Pakistan and stuff. But I do know that we are seeing more and more of it, and it will continue to increase more and more. So you just better go ahead and buckle up and get ready and decide that, you know, I'm going to stand for Jesus no matter what the consequences are. You know, that's something you're going to have to make up in your mind and your heart. And so Paul finds himself under heavy persecution, and the city was just in an uproar about it. In verses 31 and 32 then, it says, "And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down into them. And when they saw the chief captain," that's the mob, "when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating Paul." You know what that word means? It's kind of a word we don't use. It's that we don't use the word left in that way much in that context. What it means is they stopped beating Paul. Can you imagine that? So they literally have drugged Paul out of the temple. They are physically beating him. I mean, he's going to end up dead. That was their purpose. Don't question it. It says they wanted to kill Paul. That was their motive. They're wanting to kill him. They're beating him, and the only thing that stopped it was the Roman soldiers showed up. The centurions and the captain, they showed up to see what was happening. You know, talk about mob rule. They had become this. And you see that today. They have become judge, jury, and executioner. And you know what? You see it all over social media today. You see it all over, everywhere you look. People have become, self-imposed experts, self-proclaimed experts on everything, and they've become judge, jury, and executioner. That's what this cancel culture is all about. I mean, you could have done something when you were 13 years old that's embarrassing. Sure, you're not proud of it, no, but they'll dig up dirt from there and say, oh, this guy did this. We just, whatever he's doing, cancel him. Make it where he gets fired from his job, or make it where it doesn't ever have a chance of, doing anything anywhere. It's a shame. It's just really bizarre, really, but I guess we shouldn't be surprised. The prince of the power of the air, he's out and about. I said to somebody this morning that to kill and to steal and to destroy, that's what he's out to do. And so when you think about this mob rule, they were about to kill Paul. When word got back to the chief captain of the squad of Roman soldiers, he immediately took the soldiers and centurions, ran down to Paul and his companions. The crowd saw the soldiers, and they stopped beating him. And then if we look there, and we won't read it, probably all of it for sake of time, but in verses 33 through 38, there's this conversation that happens. First of all, the captain binds Paul in chains in verse 33. And then he wants to know, he asked him this question. He asked who he was and what he had done. So at least he's getting a chance to defend himself with this Roman captain to say what he had done and what, who he was. But really, The mob is the one that answered. I guess let me be clear there. It wasn't Paul that answered. It was the mob that answered. They said some cried one thing, some cried another among the multitude. And he couldn't know. It was just too much confusion. He just commanded that he be carried into this barracks of sorts, this castle that was there. And that's where Paul, as he's on the steps going up into this kind of barracks or this castle there in Jerusalem, he's going to get a chance to talk here in just a minute. But what I want to say is this. The soldiers bound him. They demanded he declare who he was, what he had done, all this. And what it caused such an uproar that culminated in a public flogging. They were publicly flogging this man. The multitude cried out different charges against him, insomuch that they couldn't make out what it was all about. They carried Paul into the castle. The soldiers had to, think about this, the soldiers had to protect Paul, and it says they even bared him up. That means they had to carry him to safety because of the violence of the people. People can be awful. I mean, they can just be downright vicious. And in this case, these people were vicious people. They would have got their hands on Paul. They would have drug him back into the crowd and certainly continued to beat him until he was dead. That's sad, but it's true. The soldiers had to protect Paul. The mob had followed them to the stairs of the castle of this fortification. Many believe this was a fortress, part of the fortress of Antonia, where these guards were kept, like a barracks of sorts. And they they had this chant that they said. They thought they were finally getting their way, maybe. They didn't get to kill him, but maybe the government will take care of it. They said, "Away with him, away with him." Doesn't sound a whole lot removed from once upon a time, some years before that, crucify him, crucify him. This chant, this mob mentality, they say, "Away with him, away with him." At this moment on the steps of the castle, Paul pleads with the chief captain that he may have a word with him and a word with the people. And here now we see a case of mistaken identity. So this is, I believe, is one of those things, I like to camp here. Not camp, but I'm going to slow down so you can see it a little bit clearer. But there was a case of mistaken identity when it came to Paul as he's there with this Roman captain. It says in verse 37, and as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" And then the captain's like, Who said, canst thou speak Greek? And it was kind of this thing. He's thinking, okay, this guy's a Greek speaker. He's speaking in Greek. But then it's confusing because he says, "Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days madest an uproar, and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" In other words, there's two things that lead him to believe that Paul is this Egyptian guy. And I'll tell you more about him in a minute, based on history. He has two things he's basing this on. He speaks Greek, and he's caused a crazy uproar in Jerusalem. Because not too long before that, there was a guy who fit this bill, the one who was this Egyptian. And I'll share that with you in just a few words here. And so, at this moment on the steps of the castle, Paul pleads with the chief captain that he may speak. And we had this case of mistaken identity, in part because Paul spoke Greek, and in part because of the uproar. The captain had mistaken him for a particular Egyptian. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, and you can't believe everything, he was not a Christian, and it was certainly not God-breathed and inspired, but according to the Jewish historian Josephus, this Egyptian that's speaking of here was a false prophet that had before garnered a rather large movement and caused a great uproar, and that he falsely prophesied and claimed that the walls of Jerusalem would fall, and he had amassed a group of men to the Mount of Olives, ready to break into Jerusalem by force. And then Governor Felix, who was made aware of this movement, marched against this Egyptian and his followers, killed a large number of them. And I'm not going to say the numbers because there's a lot of dispute about the numbers of people that were following this man. But they killed a large number of them. But the Egyptian, according to Scripture, apparently escaped along with some 4,000 men of his into the wilderness, these murderers as they're described here. But so there's this case of mistaken identity. Paul says, you've got the wrong man. He goes on to say there in verse 39, Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. So he says, look, you got the wrong guy. I'm not this guy that you think I am. And so, he goes on basically just to say he was a Jew from Tarsus, a Roman citizen of no mean city. He's a citizen of Rome, and he asked to speak to the people. The captain gave him permission, amazingly, probably, and I would say in hopes that he would settle the crowd down. I mean, maybe he can settle down the crowd, and amazingly, as Paul beckoned with his hand, the crowd grew silent. It's kind of an eerie feeling when the crowd, like I said earlier, might as well start because everybody was silent. It was just, you could have heard a pin drop. And so, amazingly, the crowd was silent. Paul took the opportunity to speak to them of the gospel and of his testimony. We'll find out in Acts chapter 22 of what God had done for him and of his experience, particularly on the road to Damascus. He spoke to these Jews in their native tongue, in Hebrew, and for that, maybe for that reason alone, as we'll see in Acts 22, they attended their ear unto him, and they kept their silence. And we should, as Paul did here, and I think Miss Christie put it very well earlier during our testimony time, we should, as Paul, take every opportunity to share the gospel. Paul could have said anything he wanted to say. He probably had a pretty good hunch that the Roman captain wanted him to say something that would calm the crowd down, that would cause them to disperse, like, hey, just, whatever it was. But you know what? He just went right into his testimony in Acts 22. And we'll turn there quickly, and we'll just have like a little prelude, and then we'll just, as the old Batman TV show will say, we'll leave a cliffhanger, and we'll pick up in Acts 22, same bat time, same bat channel next week. But Acts 22, verse 1, men, brethren, this is what Paul's saying. Men, brethren, and fathers, hear ye my defense, which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spake in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence, and he saith, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prison both men and women, as also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound to Jerusalem for to be punished. And then we won't have time for this, but I just want to read a couple verses there. And it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. That's a good cliffhanger, isn't it? And so I'll just say this, first couple verses there. It says in the last verse of chapter 21, he beckoned with his hand. I don't know what that looked like. I'm sure some Jewish historian could tell me what that looked like. But he did something with his hands to get them to listen. The crowd grew silent. He begins his defense. They maybe in reverence to their Hebrew language, they kept them more silent as Paul began to speak. And he starts as he had before. This is not new to Paul. He started as he had before, with his status, his position, his actions, his life before he was saved. He was a Jew, but more so, he was a Pharisee, learned at the feet of that great teacher of the law, Gamaliel. He wasn't just a student of the word, but he was zealous. And he supposed this mob of Jews before him, didn't have to suppose it, he saw firsthand, they were equally as zealous as he had been, for they wanted to have Paul put to death. For he too had persecuted Christians in this way, having them imprisoned or even put to death. He basically says the high priest and the elders, and whom many of them were probably present in this mob at this great gathering, because it said there was a multitude, they could corroborate his story. They knew who Paul was before he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. That they had been the ones to write the letters for him to travel to Damascus to bring Christians bound to Jerusalem. And so we're going to see as Paul is speaking to this multitude of people on the steps of this castle, if you will, this barracks of the soldiers, we're going to see next week what he says to them. He's going to tell them about what happened to him on the road to Damascus, the great blinding light, and there's more. So we'll be dismissed in a word of prayer. I'm excited. You can stand to your feet. You know you can. You don't have to have my permission. You could be really cruel being a song leader or a preacher. You could just be like, everybody stand up. Okay, sit down. Everybody stand up. No. And we might do that. There's a kid's song, I left my Bible on the church bus, and every time you hear the letter B, you got to sit down or stand up. But it's not easy even for me. Well, let's be dismissed. I'm excited for what God's doing for us and in our church. And I pray you have a wonderful week. Make Jesus the focus of your week. Just magnify and glorify Him and proclaim Him anywhere you can. I'm going to ask, I think, on somebody new tonight. Brother Ken Hunt, would you dismiss us in prayer? Please, sir.